Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm so excited to be joined by the wonderful Jane Lynch, who is the host and executive producer of The Weakest Link. And starting off, one of the things that I love about the way that you host this show is that you've really found your own identity and your own kind of like sense of humor with the series, but it still feels very connected to what Anne Robinson built with the original iteration.
Yes.
And I was curious how people having a familiarity with the format was a benefit to you, but also with there being several years between her hosting and you taking over the show, how that actually really helped you to be able to come straight in with your own voice to it.
I think that does help that there was, a palate cleanser in between Anne Robinson doing the show and me doing our version of the show. She set the tone for this thing, and it wouldn't be because show is very simple. It's a quiz show, but the fact that she was this very severe, serious as a heart attack school marm, really, I mean, I think some of the players I think were genuinely afraid of her. Now, I don't think any of our, I would be surprised if any of our contestants are genuinely afraid of me because they know that my tongue is firmly planted in my cheek. But she certainly set the bar for it. And I'm glad that we had those years in between. So I think people won't, compare me too much to her, which I'm happy for because I wouldn't assume to try to imitate what she does. And I think that would be a fool's errand if I did.
And it's such a great point that you bring up about the relationship that you have with the contestants because, you'll trade barbs and back and forth with them, but actually
Right.
then when you're asking the questions, there's like a real softness to the way that you're asking, and it feels like you're really trying to set up a space that feels safe and, you want them to succeed and do well.
I
And was that
do, and
something?
thank you for saying that. Yeah, that
Of
means a lot to
course.
me. Yeah, that they're comfortable because the clock is ticking. America's watching them. And they can be the smartest, quickest, wittiest person in the world, but sometimes that can absolutely stop a person from performing it at their highest level. And I just want to make sure that I'm not the reason for that, that I actually am there in support of them. Yeah, I really do care. I really do care that everyone does well and it's a good experience for them and they want to do it again.
And it comes across and did you have that intuition of that was the space that you wanted to create when you first started hosting it and stepped into it?
Yeah, and not like as opposed to what Anne Robinson did. That's not at all what I was thinking, but just my nature. I don't want anybody to feel bad. I like people to have a good time, and I have kind of I get jobs because I insult well. Sometimes that seems to be like people will come up to me on the street and say, insult me. Um, and I do love doing that. I'm fascinated with people who have that kind of arrogance and confidence that they can sit back and criticize others, which is obviously a part of my own personality, or I wouldn't be able to do it. But I ultimately want to slap them around and then I give them a big hug.
And of course, this isn't your first foray into hosting either with Hollywood Game Night previously. And I
Mhm.
was curious about when you first stepped onto the set for The Weakest Link, what were some of the strengths that you kind of immediately had from that previous experience, but also what were some of the spaces where you had to kind of pivot and do things a little bit differently?
Well, I spent with Hollywood Game Night. I spent those. I think it was 6 seasons. It's basically herding cats and doing 5 different games every show, and most of the time we did 2 or 3 shows a day. So I became pretty facile in the brain department to do that, and so doing The Weakest Link was very simple. It was so pared down, and it was a relief to stand behind that podium and yeah, it was easy and fun. And I see Hollywood Game Night as being um, game show hosting boot camp. I really was put to the test. There were so many moving parts that I had to keep track of. And in The Weakest Link, it's so simple. It's so easy and it's fun and I love doing Hollywood Game Night, but I was like this the whole time. And this, I'm just stand behind my podium and I have these lovely people in front of me and it goes smoothly and I just love it. It's really fun. And I love quiz shows. I love trivia. Always have. I was a big game show fan as a kid. I used to stay home from school. I used to fake sick so I could watch all of the shows that were on in daytime quiz shows. I loved them.
Right. I've heard you talk previously about how you loved things like Tattletales and Password
Mm-hmm.
and Match Game. And
Match
with,
Game.
with how much you loved it growing up and how much you would watch it, when you first stepped into hosting game shows, how did the experience marry up to the idea that you'd always had of what that might be like, or how was it really different?
It married up to it. It did. It felt exactly like I thought it would feel. But like I said, Hollywood Game Night was much more complex. I think much more complex than, and I don't want to pat myself on the back too much, break my arm patting myself in the back, but I think it might have been, I think it's one of the more complicated, so many moving parts um, game shows out there because it's 5 different games with celebrities and civilian type people. So you have a lot of them are wild cards in the most delightful way. The celebrities, they were on the show because they are inventive and fast, and and I was just the person who had to allow them that space and then go, okay, now we're moving to this, and now we're moving. That's why I called it herding cats sometimes, but it was a delight, just a delight. What was your original question before I broke my arm patting myself on the back?
No, it was, you answered it perfectly because it was to do with like the idea of what it was
Oh
going to be like.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I especially the weakest link is exactly how I thought it would be. Hosting a game show.
And I mean, there is a lot of space of you have that mix of things that are scripted that you kind of know in advance for each show. But even as
Mhm.
the host, you don't necessarily know what direction things are going to take because it depends how well people are doing, how
Right,
they kind of trade conversation with you and what that
right.
feels like in the moment. And so what is that experience of going into each episode and having a real sensibility of being in charge of the flow, but also knowing that there's so much that could come up at any moment?
Well, I always say, and I do this in terms of when I act too, is I love having a cage with like parameters, and there is the game, there are the rounds. So there are things that are givens that don't change no matter what. And there are rules. And then I like to bounce through. I love that feeling of bouncing around freely against the walls of that cage. And I think it's important to have that structure too for the contestants, and that they can trust that I'm going to enforce those parameters so they can feel safe and just play their best game. Again, what was your question?
No, again,
I'm
you
only
touched
on
on
my
it.
first cup, so
I
oh,
mean,
I see. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That combination of their being like structure and the ability to just kind of have a lot of fun, and everything's different. It's like we threw 2 dinner parties this weekend at our house, and they were completely different experiences. But we served the exact same food, we had the exact same schedule, and about the one was 4 people and the other was 8, but they were completely different dinner parties because of the people.
I also think when it comes to the elements where you're ad-libbing and scripting on the spot, that the execution of that really does speak to the experience that you have over the years in your career, because you have to be comfortable enough to step into that. And I was really interested in what some of the previous experience that you have in your career that you feel like has really helped you to step into it so comfortably.
When I was uh oh god, it was like the late 80s. There was a show, there was a home shopping show. It was the first one ever, and it was 24 hours, and I became a host. I auditioned and became a host for the like 11 p.m. till 3 in the morning, and we took live phone calls. Now imagine who's calling into a home shopping show in the middle of the night. So we had to negotiate all of that and handle all of that, and had to talk for 7 or 8 minutes about a cubic zirconia tennis bracelet. So I learned how to be on my feet and fill the time, because you can't, on live television, you can't pause and go, what am I doing here? You're on the entire time. So I learned a lot doing that. I learned how to be good on my feet, how to think fast, how to be spontaneous, and knowing that you can't plan everything. All you had was like this notebook that said cubic zirconia bracelet, and there were like 8 features. And you had to riff on those 8 features without, boring America to death. And I had a co-host too. And so we would go back and forth, and we ended up having a lot of fun. And both of us learned a lot. She's still doing it. Her name is Kendi Klepfer. And she ended up being like she was great at it. She's perfect at it.
I love those moments where something so unexpected becomes a really useful tool in something that you're doing much later on. It's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there also a huge benefit for you in terms of the contestants coming onto the show are so familiar with the format at this point, and so
Yeah.
they really understand what the flow is going to be, what the parameters are going to be, and how does that help you as a host?
Oh, absolutely. Then, I'm not teaching them the game. And that's what's so great about the people who choose our contestants. They really put these folks through their paces so that they, are going to follow the rules. Not only are they good at trivia, they're interesting people. They're willing to, be a team and at the same time try to win. But we ended up having like the quality of the people in Hollywood Game Night too are just stunning people. They're just wonderful, lovely. They're there to play, and I think our contestant choosers know how to do this. So that is always, I'm so grateful to them for that. Our show is a lot of moving parts, and everybody who is assigned to a part is the best at what they do.
Yeah, the casting's really incredible. And, I think especially at the beginning when you're introducing yourself and just getting those little tidbits, how are you
Mm-hmm.
really using those first conversations to kind of tee up the idea of where you might take conversations and rapport with them later in the show, where you're able to
Yeah.
get a little bit more in depth?
Exactly. And, I have a Stuart Krasnow, who is our executive producer, in my ear. And nobody keeps, I mean, he's a great producer, but nobody keeps the picture, the whole in mind the way this guy does. And he's also hilarious. And he has maybe a meaner sense of humor than I do. So he has told me to say some things that I would be like, I can't say that to another human being. But he's good. He's great at what he does.
And you have to be so adept in the conversation and the way that you're relying and trusting everyone behind the scenes, from Stuart to the
Yes.
person adding the scripts to the teleprompter. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
what are all those elements that we're not necessarily seeing on screen that are just constantly in flow between you and the production team?
An amazing writing staff that is at a moment's notice. They work their asses off on that script that we're going to be doing that day. And then things change, and I get 10 hilarious alts, things that I can say that will, express what craziness just happened in the show. So just great writers. Ann Slichter and Grant Taylor are like, they go with me wherever I go. And they're just great. Not only great, like behind their computers by themselves writing, they write together, but also on the floor when we're shooting this thing, they're right there. And we have a staff of writers too who are just amazing.
It's so great. And I think also like you get to meet contestants who come from so many different spaces and walks of life. One minute you're talking to someone who's a bird trainer working with penguins, and then there's a teacher. And, how do you kind of try to set them up for success in the conversation that you're having, to really tap into what is going to be interesting for them to be able to talk about and for the audience to be able to connect to, because it's such a finite amount of time to give us a sense of who they are.
Well, they, before they come out, the producers have said, we're going to focus on this part of yourself. So they don't tell their life story. They focus on the fact that they're a bartender, and they'll talk about that. And maybe something interesting about that, because they've interviewed these people and they say, oh, that's an interesting thing that you actually, studied neuroscience and decided to throw it all away, and now you're a bartender, and we'll talk about that. But it's just little pieces of things. You don't want to get too general about somebody's life. You really want to hone in on something, and everybody's got something interesting, or you can make it sound interesting.
And it's always so fun to watch the way that they either form alliances or, they'll decide
or not
their nemesis.
Right. Yeah. What's funny is sometimes they're so nice that they don't play strategically. And then you'll get like one person and they end up looking like the asshole, but they're playing strategically, and they're going to eliminate the person who's on a roll, because they don't want to go against them in the final round. They want to go against the person who's kind of struggling. So yeah, so some people play, and the whole banking thing too. When they have the wherewithal to bank, they can make really good money and keep that chain going. And it happened with the when we had the military show. Within the first round, they banked and had an unbroken chain for the first time in our history, in our show history. The military, the disciplined, and then they worked as a team, and then they started going after each other. And that was a joy to watch.
Based on all the different ways that you've gotten to watch people play the show, whether it's emotionally or strategically, how do you think you would approach it if you were on the other side?
Oh, I would have to constantly, first of all, I couldn't be drinking coffee. I'd have to tell myself, just relax, 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 because I get like this. And I actually do have a lot of crazy facts going around in my head. I do know some obscure stuff that might really help me on this game, but I just have to have the wherewithal. So I'm aware of that with them too. I project on them that they're going to need to relax too. So that's what I try to do is when we do have those small talk moments that don't end up on camera, but like maybe when we go to a commercial break, I just by rules, I'm not supposed to get too close to any of them because then it'll look like I'm favoring someone, but just kind of our back and forth, little kind of, talk about the weather, this inconsequential small talk. I always hope that it relaxes them and that they see this is just, just relax. You're so much you're going to play so much better if you don't have that high stake adrenaline thing going, because that can just shut you down sometimes.
And how do you feel that your flow in working on the show and hosting the show has really changed and evolved from when you first started? Because obviously when you first came in to your first season, it's learning the ropes of a lot of things, and now you're so adept at it in so many ways, and it must be second nature to a degree.
It is. It's well, and this is kind of, I think, human nature, but it's certainly Jane nature. I make everything harder than it is in the beginning, because I think I'm going to lose track of something, even though this show was so much more straightforward than Hollywood Game Night. Oh my God, my stress level doing Hollywood Game Night, I was like this, maybe you couldn't see it in my face, but I'm like this. And the weakest link, I realized, like probably in our second or third episode, this is easy. It's simple. Just sit back and relax and don't read the teleprompter too fast. And, don't worry, we can always say, can I take that back? In fact, I don't even say, can I take that back anymore? I just go, and I start over again. Because, editing is a wonderful thing. So now it's just pure joy to do it. It's absolute joy to do it. I have no stress. I used to have stress walking in on a new group of contestants because we haven't met before, and I have so much. I want it to be a great experience for them. And the beginning was COVID too, so we couldn't even meet. I would have to stand at my podium and they'd bring them in. And we kind of still do that, actually. It works out, but I don't have that social anxiety that I used to have.
It's so wonderful to hear, because I think part of the joy in watching the show and watching you host it is that you can sense that sense of fun and how much you enjoy it. So it's been so wonderful to hear all about this. Thank you so much, Jane. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.